This presentation is a proposal to conduct a multiple case study of the dark side of leadership. It was an exploration of executives who led their companies to disastrous results versus executives who did not. I am Marilyn Baker, and this was originally presented to Drs. Bokarnia, Becker, and Osula of Regent University on October the 12th of 2012, and it has been slightly edited in September 2014, mainly to enhance the visual aspects of the presentation. The agenda for this presentation begins with an introduction, moves to the literature review, reviews my research questions driving this proposal, the proposed methodology, anticipated ethical issues, and the significance of this study. In the introduction, we'll take a look at names used for dark side leaders, a proposed definition, warnings about dark side leaders, and how this proposal responds to calls for certain kinds of research. Some of the names of dark side leaders include corporate psychopaths, leaders without conscience, personalized charismatics, pseudo-transformational leaders, rogues, toxic leaders, and tyrants. Since there's no commonly accepted term or definition of dark side leaders, for purposes of this proposal, I will use that term to mean self-serving leaders who have led or are likely to lead their constituents or organizations into destruction. In sum, they are destructive leaders. There have been many warnings about dark side leaders. Let's take a look at a few. In 1990, Conger said, "The very behaviors that distinguish leaders from managers also have the potential to produce disastrous outcomes for their organizations." Seidman said in 1997, "The terrorists of the world of finance are not bombers, but are the rogue traders and rogue institutions. Such rogues could seriously threaten the financial system in a country or parts of the world." How prophetic. In 2007, Woods wrote, "Unethical behavior at the top can destabilize everything from the banking system to the stock market." And Jesus said, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them." To paraphrase Jesus, dark side leaders look innocent on the outside, but inside they are self-serving predators. So how can we identify them? By the consequences of their actions. This study responds to calls for additional research on the dark side of leadership, research on leaders of financial institutions associated with the global financial crisis, and new ways of researching and thinking about leaders. We move now to the literature review, which consists of 4 pillars. First, 4 historically significant financial crises. Second, studies of the dark side of leadership. Third, dysfunctional personalities of dark side leaders and white-collar crime. And fourth, executive leadership and management theories. We'll start with the 4 historically significant financial crises, which are the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939, which began with the stock market crash. We move to the S&L and banking crisis of the 1980s. Then the tech stock bubble of the 1990s that crashed in the early 2000s, often called the dot-com crash. And last but not least, the global financial crisis, which was also referred to as the Great Recession of the 2000s, which was marked by the housing market crash. Let's take a look at what led up to the Great Depression, the Roaring Twenties. A stronger economy after World War I led to higher demand for investment securities, as well as other assets, and this greater demand led to higher prices, higher levels of borrowing to purchase securities, and irrational exuberance, which Schiller refers to as irrationally high, unsustainable prices for securities. That would include stocks and bonds. The Depression began in 1929 when the stock market crashed. This resulted in high unemployment, defaults on loans, panic-driven run on banks, and thousands of banks failed. So how did this happen? The United States Senate created the Pecora Commission, and here's a summary of the report that was issued by the Pecora Commission. There were rampant unethical business practices, especially in banking, which included misleading or inadequate information, irresponsible lending practices, excessive executive compensation and bonuses, unethical acts to manipulate stock prices, and bribing of government officials. As a result of the findings of the Pecora Commission, legislation was passed. Let's take a look at the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. This split investment and commercial banks and also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, commonly referred to as the FDIC. Two other acts were also passed, the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. These were created to regulate securities trading and establish the Securities and Exchange Commission, commonly referred to as the SEC. As we can see from this graph, the number of failed or assisted banks and savings and loans changed dramatically after the legislation was passed in 1933. During the 1920s, thousands of banks failed, but from 1933 onward, only a few hundred failed of a period of over 4 decades. Move now to the 1980s and the savings and loan and banking crises that occurred in the 1980s, plus the beginning of a rise in financial scandals. Again, we look at what led up to the S&L and banking crisis, and many believe it resulted from deregulation. The Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 granted savings and loans the power to make commercial loans with less regulatory oversight than commercial banks. In 1982, the Garnes-St. Germain Depository Institutions Act allowed adjustable rate mortgages, which paved the way for making riskier loans. The savings and loans made increasingly risky commercial loans. Business was good until the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was passed, and that act reduced tax deductions for passive activity such as rental property. When that happened, demand for commercial real estate fell, prices fell, and thousands of loans went into default. Properties went into foreclosure. Once again, let's take a look at the number of failed or assisted banks. As you can see, hundreds of banks failed after deregulation, primarily because they had inadequate reserves for bad loans. The graph shows that after the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, the number of bank failures and savings and loan failures declined rapidly, and very few failed for decades. But following the 1980 and 1982 savings and loan deregulation, you can see an increase in the number of failures through the 1980s until there were nearly 600 failures in the late 1980s. We'll take a look briefly at financial scandals of the 1980s. During this time, many financial scandals occurred, and the accounting profession was harshly criticized for failing to find fraudulent activity during the audits, and this of course includes savings and loans. Several professional accounting organizations formed the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, called COSO, in 1985 to support a commission that was headed by James Treadway. This is often called the Treadway Commission. Its purpose was to identify causes of fraudulent financial reporting. The Treadway Commission concluded in 1987 that top management sets the tone at the top for the organization, whether that tone is ethical or unethical. Most major frauds were perpetrated by top executives, especially the chief executive officer and/or the chief financial officer. We move now to the 1990s and the early 2000s when we look at the rise and fall of the dot-coms and technology stocks. We look now at the dot-com and technology stock bubble. Following the S&L crisis, investors shifted from real estate back to stocks and bonds. They were enamored of the novelty of the dot-coms and the tech stocks. Price-to-earning ratios rose rapidly, and once again irrational exuberance ensued, with PE ratios rising even higher than they were prior to the October 1929 stock market crash. This graph illustrates historic price-to-earning ratios from 1880 to 2012. As you can see, the PE ratio ranged from the 1880s until the 1920s, generally between 5 and 25. Note that during World War I, PE ratios fell as stock prices fell. However, with the roaring 20s, we see the sharp increase in the PE ratios until they peaked in 1929, just before the stock market crash. We see that after the correction of the Great Recession, ratios once again returned to the 5 to 25 range until the 1990s, when we see that the stock prices rose very, very rapidly, peaking at 2000 and then plummeting thereafter with the bursting of the dot-com bubble. So let's take a look at this dot-com and technology stock crash. In the early 2000s, we began with a host of major corporate scandals, frauds, and bankruptcies. 2000 and 2001, many dot-coms failed. 2001 and 2002, we had 3 Fortune 500 corporations, Enron, WorldCom, and Adelphia, declared bankruptcy and had to restate their financials due to fraud. As a result, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002. What does the Sarbanes-Oxley Act require? That chief executive officers and chief financial officers certify the integrity of the financial statements. And it also requires more disclosure of off-balance sheet financing. You may recall the reference to special purpose entities in the Enron scandal. We move now to the Great Recession and the global financial crisis. Again, we look at the prelude to the events that happened. There were 2 laws that were passed that deregulated investment banks. First, we have the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, and this act repealed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which split commercial and investment banks, and allowed them once again to merge. Then the Commodities Future Modernization Act, the CFMA, exempted derivatives from regulation. Now, derivatives are securities whose value is derived from other assets, in this case, subprime mortgages. Many mortgage companies aggressively promoted highly profitable subprime loans. These companies sold the loans to investment banks so that they could make more loans. Investment bankers repackaged the loans and sold them to investors as government-backed mortgage derivatives because of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The investment bankers lobbied the SEC to lower their reserve requirements so they could invest even more money in subprime mortgage derivatives. Unfortunately, the SEC agreed to lower those reserves. Once again, irrational exuberance set in, and in this case, home prices rose rapidly to unsustainable levels. Home ownership and mortgage loan foreclosures reached post-depression high. Nevertheless, mortgage companies continued to promote subprime loans, apparently ignoring the increasing number of foreclosures. And unfortunately, the ratings agencies did not downgrade the derivatives, that is, until it was too late. In 2006, the housing bubble bursts. As you can see on this graph from irrationalexuberance.com, the housing prices rose rapidly in the early 2000s peaked in 2006 and then rapidly declined. With a sharp fall in housing prices, the Great Recession began. Mortgage companies began to fail in 2006, and these included companies such as Ameriquest, Countrywide Financial, and Washington Mutual, the bank that turned into a subprime lender. These were followed by investment banks in 2007 and 8, which included Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, and Wachovia, which was also heavily involved as a subprime lender. What happened? A failure of leadership. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission concluded that leaders failed to set a proper tone at the top of their organizations, an observation very similar to the Treadway Commission in the 1980s. The FCIC also concluded that there was a systemic breakdown in accountability and ethics. Is there a pattern of financial crises? It seems that the economy improves and irrational exuberance ensues. This means that prices increase to unsustainable levels. During this time, unscrupulous dark side leaders take advantage of self-serving opportunities, and the bubble eventually bursts. Prices fall, market crashes, and loans default. Businesses fail, and people suffer, losing their homes, their savings, their jobs, etc. But the dark side leaders walk away rich, for they are very rarely convicted of their crimes. We move now to our second pillar, prior studies of the dark side of leadership. We'll start with transformational and charismatic leadership literature. In 1978, Burns contrasted good and moral leadership from the dark immoral leadership of tyrannical leaders. House and Howell in 1992 differentiated between socialized charismatics and personalized charismatics. Howell and Avolio in 92 and 95 differentiated between ethical and unethical charismatics. And in 1999, Bass and Stottlemyre differentiated between authentic transformational leaders and pseudo-transformational leaders. Other studies of the dark side include Kellerman's studies of bad leadership, where she emphasized the importance of character, with bad leadership ranging from incompetent to evil. And then there were a series of studies on toxic leadership, beginning with Wicker in 1996, who described toxic leaders as maladjusted, malcontent, and often malevolent, to Lipman Blumen's 2005 study, who says that we ignore toxic leaders' faults because their charisma blinds us. Lipman Blumen tied toxic leadership to personality dysfunctions, including the lack of integrity, insatiable ambition, arrogance, and avarice. Woods in 2007 found that both situational factors and personality dysfunction contributed to the rise of dark side leadership. Some other studies include Ashforth's petty tyrants who lord their power over others, reminiscent of Jesus' teachings in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Tepper's study of abusive supervisors who are morally disengaged, aggressive, narcissistic, and have a Theory X orientation. We move to Pillar 3, where we focus more on the dysfunctional personalities and white-collar crime. Many psychologists and sociologists assert that personality dysfunction is a major cause of white-collar crime. Subclinical psychopaths, also called sociopaths, are especially tied to white-collar crime. Kangemi and Fole assert that sociopathic leaders are predators who have the remorseless willingness to do whatever it takes to get what they want. If we look at sociopathy and psychopathy, Tavkoli equates today's sociopathic executives with the robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Hare and Babiak call nonviolent business psychopaths social predators and snakes in suits. Stout estimates that approximately 4% of the people in the United States are charismatic sociopaths who have no conscience. Bodie posits that corporate psychopath theory of the global financial crisis, and he states that corporate psychopaths rising to key senior positions within modern financial corporations have largely caused the global financial crisis. Lawrence in 2010 had a very similar hypothesis where he wrote, "I believe that some very few top-level bankers were people without conscience who knowingly took advantage of certain social and economic conditions to orchestrate the massive subprime mortgage disaster to greatly enhance their own personal wealth." We move now to Pillar 4, Executive Leadership and Top Management Theories. There are two classic and conflicting schools of thought, agency theory and stewardship theory, and this comes from Davis, Sherman, and Donaldson in 1997. Agency theory focuses on the economic man and rational decision-making based on profitability. The agency theory assumes that leaders are self-serving and opportunistic, and that they are motivated by lower order needs and extrinsic rewards. Stewardship theory is actually based more on self-actualizing and a concern for the collective organization such as the firm. They are motivated by higher order needs and intrinsic rewards. Let's contrast the managerial style assumed under agency theory with stewardship theory. For agency theory, the managerial style is based on being control-oriented, with a short-term focus, cost-controlling, individualistic, and high power distance between executives and non-executives. In contrast, the stewardship theory managerial style is involvement-oriented, with a longer-term focus, performance-enhancing rather than cost-controlling, collectivistic, and a low power distance between executives and non-executives. When we compare with leadership theories, agency theory is very similar to transacting leadership and is morally neutral or negative. Stewardship theory is very similar to positive leadership theories such as transforming, servant, or spiritual leadership, and it is morally positive. We look now at the upper echelon theory, which is an opportunity to combine different theories. Hambrick and Mason argue that organizations are a reflection of their situation and their top management team, or the upper echelon. Their theory holds that we look at the objective situation, both the internal and external pressures, the upper echelons, or the top management team's characteristics, including psychological and demographic characteristics, and they argue that these affect the strategic choices that are made by the top management team. Whether we're looking at innovation, diversification, acquisitions, backward or forward integration, whatever the strategic choice, it is influenced by the objective situation and the upper echelon's characteristics. This influences then the organizational performance, such as its long-term profitability, growth, and survival. Let's look now for calls for ethical strategic leaders. Ireland and Hitt assert that strategic leadership for the 21st century must include sustaining an effective organizational culture, emphasizing ethical practices, and establishing balanced organizational controls with an emphasis on the long term. Wilson in 2002 argues that ethics are the key to long-term sustainability. Calls for moral leaders in business go back a long way, at least as far as Henri Fayol and Chester Bernard. Trevina, Hartman, and Brown found that unethical leaders are more likely to base decisions on short-term bottom-line results and are less concerned with leaving the organization a better place. But what is ethical leadership? Unfortunately, I found that there are disagreements which exist over what constitutes ethical leadership, and this is highlighted in an article by Avolio and Locke in 2002. Bruce Avolio argues that leaders should embrace altruism, transcending their own interest for the common good. In contrast, Edwin Locke, a disciple of Ayn Rand, argues that leaders should embrace egoism, also called rational self-interest, and he asserts that the highest virtue is not altruism, but rather rationality. We move now to the research questions, and while this is adapted from my original research proposal, please note that much of this will be positioned in past tense, as I have at this point actually completed my dissertation. We will look at the research questions within the framework of the upper echelon theory model, which looks at situations, personal characteristics, strategic decisions, and organizational outcomes. What were the situations faced by these executives? What pressures and opportunities or temptations were there? What are the personal characteristics of the dark side leaders? Do they exhibit behaviors suggestive of dysfunctional personalities? And what differentiates destructive versus exemplary leadership? And what strategic choices do dark side leaders make? Did they take excessive risk? Did they commit fraud? Did they cut costs too much? What were the resulting organizational outcomes? Damaged reputation? Bankruptcy? Involuntary acquisition or demise? So let's take a look at my research proposal. Patton asserts that extreme case samples allow a researcher to focus on the best or the worst of a phenomenon. So I propose to study 3 groups or quintons of executives that exemplify the best and worst chief executive officers in recent times. Note that a quinton is a collection of cases that represent a collective target, and in my case, extremely good and extremely bad executives. The 3 proposed quintons were dark side executives of financial institutions associated with a financial crisis, dark side executives whom experts have rated as being among the worst CEOs in recent history, and exemplary executives whom experts have rated as being among the best executives in recent history. Stake asserts that comparison is a grand research strategy, that the quinton is something to be described and interpreted. So I plan to compare and contrast cases within and across the quintons, identifying key themes for each group, as well as themes that differentiated the groups. For data collection, I plan to collect data for each executive from journal articles, interviews, documentaries, autobiographies, biographies, and other documents associated with each executive. Stake recommends the use of a semi-structured data collection form for each case to facilitate cross-case comparisons. This would be similar to questionnaires that are used in a semi-structured interview. So I plan to use a data collection form to collect data for each executive. Since there's no survey instrument widely used to measure dark side leadership, I developed a data collection form from the themes that emerged in the literature review, and I organized the themes within the framework of the upper echelon theory. Triangulation involves using more than one method or source to study a phenomenon, so I plan to use multiple source documents for each case, and each CEO is indeed a case. Additionally, Stake asserts that purposefully selected multi-case samples also aid in triangulation by studying a phenomenon, or in my case a quinton, from multiple perspectives. By purposefully choosing executives clustered in 3 distinct quintons, I had the ability to conduct cross-case analysis within the groups to identify and verify key themes for each quinton, and to conduct cross-group analysis comparing and contrasting key findings across the 3 quintons. Stake and Yin recommend using data matrices to summarize key findings and to facilitate analysis. Here is an example of a multi-case database or a data matrix. We have themes going down the page, starting with the original themes on the original data collection forms, and we have cases. In my situation, it would be executives moving across the page for each of the 3 quintons. Please note that in a data matrix, there should be flexibility to capture emergent themes in the data collection and analysis process. With regard to data analysis and reporting, my report, which of course is my dissertation, focused on key themes for each quinton rather than detailed reports for each case. My dissertation also summarized key findings regarding similarities and differences across the 3 groups. Let's take a look now at any potential ethical issues. No ethical issues were anticipated because data was collected from publicly available documents. I had not worked for any of these executives or their companies, so there was no breach of confidentiality. And when providing examples for key themes, all of them were supported by several executives rather than just a single individual. So what is the significance of this study? Why even bother? Well, the significance of the proposal was that it responds to calls for additional research on the dark side of leadership, and specifically on the dark side of executives. It also responds to calls for research to investigate the personalities of CEOs associated with a financial crisis, and to calls for new research and new ways of thinking about leaders. It also integrates literature from multiple disciplines such as the leadership literature, management, psychology, forensic science, and risk management. And it will add to the literature on the upper echelon theory. Thank you for your interest in my proposal. My dissertation defense video is also available, and for more detailed information, my dissertation is available through ProQuest.